Welcome to the KR Queen channel, where I evaluate complex questions and present the results to you as though to a jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my name is Corey Queen. I'm an attorney in Seattle, Washington, and before law school I was a campus minister at the University of Tennessee. This is the first installment of my Atheists on Trial series. The case before you today is Alex O'Connor versus Christianity. The question for your consideration is this: has Alex demonstrated that Christianity is irrational? I'll show you that he hasn't. Now, sometimes in a lawsuit, the person who gets sued will also countersue. That's called a counterclaim. And in the course of my research on Alex, I've discovered that we need to make a counterclaim here. So a second question for your consideration is this: has Alex demonstrated that his own platform is irrational? I'll show you that he has. But first, let's get some context. In April of 2016, Alex is barely 17 years old and posts a video about the so-called paradox of prayer, in which he engages the theology of prayer with all the depth and confidence one would expect from a 17-year-old Christopher Hitchens enthusiast. In those early stages, Alex demonstrates some very strong anti-religious fervor. His parents are atheists, but mom didn't used to be, and he's very bitter about being raised somewhat Christian. And he's especially bitter about Christians relaying to him the idea of hell. To him, the whole concept of hell is disturbing and immoral, and he was very grateful to discover that someday he'll fall back into the same void that Nelson Mandela and Adolf Hitler fell into, regardless of what kind of life he lives. He found that much less concerning, and wishes someone other than his dad would have made that clearer to him as a child. So in the early stages of Alex's channel, he describes the Bible as evil and dangerous. The God of the Bible is a maniac who commits mindless genocide and condones slavery. In short, Christianity is for morons. Of course, this is nothing new. Paul once wrote that Christianity is, quote, foolishness to the Greeks, and the Greek word he used for foolishness is moria, the root word of moron. It's also a root word for sophomore, sophos meaning wise or learned, and moros meaning foolish or ignorant. In other words, a sophomore is one who learns enough to feel smart, but still has quite a ways to go. And by the time Alex is a sophomore, he's already made quite a name for himself. Around the same time, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was on the rise in American politics and refusing to debate Ben Shapiro, but thankfully the British AOC, Alex O'Connor, was also on the rise, and in an unexpected turn of events, he would go on to debate Shapiro. So Shapiro got his AOC debate after all. Now, from the beginning of his channel, Alex is open about his mission. He wants to oppose religion, especially Christianity, and debunk its ideas. In his first debate with Jonathan McClatchy, he says he went to theology school to, quote, keep his enemies close. I will grant that over time there is a shift in his tone. His views become more mature, or at least he presents them with more sophistication, but he still maintains, as recently as his September 2023 discussion with Alistair McGrath, that the goal of his platform is to show that atheism is true, and relatedly that the major religions are false. So his purpose and message are completely unchanged from day one. The modern Alex is saying the same things, often with the same arguments, that 17-year-old Alex said, just with more sophistication. Even so, while scrutinizing his overall case against Christianity, I'm going to be as fair as possible to him and focus on his strongest and most recent arguments, and I'll refer to his earlier material only when it informs the current debate. So much for introductions. Let's get into it. And let's begin with one of Alex's most common statements. Atheism is not a position. I'm not making any claims here. Now, if we look at the history of philosophy, this type of statement is a pretty recent development in the conversation. Atheism and agnosticism were understood to mean what common sense tells us that they mean. Atheism means, I believe God does not exist, and agnosticism says, I'm not sure whether God exists. In the philosophical community, atheists and theists alike were pretty well in agreement on this point. I've linked an article on atheism and agnosticism from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy if you want more details on this. But yes, it's not hard to work out that the etymology of atheism is atheism, technically denoting the mere absence of belief, but it's also not hard to work out that the purpose of language is a meeting of the minds and not just to win clever word games, so I'd like to think we could all just use our common sense here. And in fact, I always tell juries, you're allowed to use your common sense, but Alex wants us to define our terms and set parameters for the discussion, so let's do it. This recent aggressive shift to redefine atheism and weaken its claim from belief that God doesn't exist to a simple lack of belief can be traced to a few places. One major reason is Antony Flew, the Oxford philosophy professor and champion of atheism, who wrote The Presumption of Atheism in 1976 and redefined atheism. And he was clear on why he wanted to do so. Here's a quote from that book. "The debate about the existence of God should properly begin from the presumption of atheism, and the onus of proof must lie upon the theist." So he makes it clear, this is about shifting the burden of proof away from atheists and onto theists. As you can imagine, the atheists were quite upset when Antony flew right out of their camp and into theism. I guess his burden of proof was met, but he's not their only champion. We also have Carl Sagan, who popularized the sort of Humean assertion that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is the so-called Sagan standard. Sagan being the atheist pop science writer who helped lead a big, expensive project to send messages into space just in case aliens might answer. Sagan is much like Richard Dawkins in that he does some good science, but when he leaves his area of expertise to dabble in philosophy, he starts sounding, sophomoric, which is why you won't hear any philosopher quoting Sagan on anything. That said, one atheist, other than Antony Flew, who does have some philosophical clout, is Bertrand Russell, and he framed his burden of proof argument around what is now called Russell's teapot, and it goes like this. If I assert without evidence that there's a teapot orbiting the sun, I have the burden of proving it. Otherwise, it's irrational for anyone to believe it. And I, like any thoughtful Christian, agree. It is irrational to believe assertions made without evidence. Even more philosophically impressive than Russell was his protege, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who many say was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century and who, to Russell's great chagrin, was nicknamed the man with the Gospels and dedicated his life's work to the glory of the Most High God. I don't believe Wittgenstein ever found evidence for his mentor's teapot, but it appears he did find evidence for God. But I digress. All these attempts by atheists to soften and redefine what it means to be an atheist have the same goal, shifting the burden of proof off of atheism and onto theism. The way they frame it, Christians posit the existence of God, which means they are making the affirmative claim and therefore have the burden of proof. Conversely, if atheists say they're not making any claims, then they can avoid any burden of proof, meaning they can hold their position without evidence, which is a nice advantage to have. Now, aside from being philosophically dubious and certainly not widely accepted, this whole burden of proof tactic is also misleading. Let's reduce the question of God's existence to its simplest form. Is the most basic, fundamental reality, the thing that simply exists because it exists, is that a mind or is it mindless? Now, we perceive lots of things around us, both mind and mindless, but it's apparently not obvious on the face of it which came first. And I say apparently because it seems obvious to me that whatever made these phenomena available to my senses and made my senses available to sense them, it wasn't mindless. But that's not a very useful argument. So the question at the most basic level is, did a mind first exist and make everything else? Or did something mindless first exist and organize itself mindlessly into everything we now see? Christianity has an answer to that question. When God speaks to Moses in Exodus, he gives himself this title, I am. So in Christianity, there's only one thing that simply is because it is, and that's God. The materialist answer to this question is that something mindless would have the right to say, I am, if it could speak. Only one of these options can be true. You can either pick one, or you can say, I don't know. But atheists frame it this way. They'll say, I'm not believing in anything, whereas you believe in God, so you have the burden of proof. Only then they'll go on to assume materialism across the board. So they're not really saying I don't know. They're trying to assert materialism, but avoid having to support that assertion with any evidence. So I would think we're starting on even footing here because we're asking a question that goes to the fundamental, basic reality. And before evaluating the evidence, I'll be generous and say it's a true 50-50 coin toss between a mindful or mindless base level of reality, but it's far from obvious that it's mindless. There's something else we should keep in mind. The burden of proof doesn't affect the substance of the argument at all. It's purely a framing mechanism to help win a debate. It's tactical. In my field, the burden of proof is often the difference between winning or losing a case. The criminal burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high burden because of the very high stakes. The civil burden of proof, on the other hand, is preponderance of the evidence. More probable than not, 51% or more likely, meaning the exact same case with the exact same evidence could easily win under one burden and easily lose under the other. So even if I granted atheists that only I have the burden of proof, none of them have ever told me what that burden is. Is it logically airtight proof? Because if that's the case, I can't even prove to you that I exist. I can't prove anything to you. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Preponderance of the evidence? How do we decide which burden? And when does it cut both ways? In a legal case, you might not have the overall burden of proof, but still have the burden of proof on certain sub-questions within the overall case. So, are there any sub-questions atheists have the burden of proving, or do they insist that they never have to present evidence to support their claims? For instance, maybe I say, sure, I'll take Sagan's standard. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, I think materialism is an extraordinary assumption. Our observable universe mindlessly pops into existence and mindlessly organizes itself into everything we see and experience. That's quite an assumption, and if you want me to accept it, I personally would like to see some evidence. But again, this whole burden of proof framing is just a way to avoid facing just how extraordinary these atheist, and I really mean materialist, assumptions are. If I can hide behind never having to support my assumptions with evidence, that makes my job as an atheist really easy. It is interesting, though, because if they were confident that the evidence supported their views, they wouldn't need to hide behind these kinds of framing mechanisms to win the debate. They would just present their evidence. But since we're here talking about framing, I would like to offer a framing mechanism that I think is a lot more useful for this conversation. What if, instead of the burden of proof, we use the burden of trust? What are you building your life around and trusting that it will hold you up in the end? And this can be asked at a few levels. For instance, if you get in the car and drive to the store, you do so trusting on balance that you won't get hit and killed by another driver. You can't prove that you'll make it. You know there's a risk, but on the burden of trust, that risk seems small enough that it's worth it. The burden of trust asks, what do you trust with enough confidence that you'll risk something for it? What are you willing to bet your life, health, safety, or comfort on? Framed this way, I no longer care if the atheist is making an affirmative claim. That's not the most relevant question, because the fact remains that we all have to bet our lives on certain things. And in the case of atheism, they're betting on materialist assumptions. Public atheists in particular are not just betting on their own beliefs, they're betting on promoting a certain way of thinking that intentionally targets other people's beliefs, which in Alex's case means actively trying to obstruct belief in Jesus. So you've got to be trusting very strongly that Christianity is false, that everyone who's ever bought into it was wrong, and that the God of Abraham and Jesus is no risk to you. You're trusting this so strongly that you're willing to actively, publicly undermine the worldview. And I do have to admit, this has always been a bit strange to me. I often wonder why some atheists are so evangelistic about it. In fact, that's not even really the right way to say it, because the etymology of evangelism goes to the Greek euangelion, which means to spread good news, but materialism isn't good news. It's terrible news. Our life is a meaningless blip on the universal radar, except there is no radar, because no one will ever know or care what happened here. It will have been a brief and pointless taste of existence before we fall back into the void we briefly clawed our way out of. And none of the suffering, injustice, bloodshed, tragedy, or any other evil will ever be set right, because evil doesn't actually exist. It's all just brute facts. Life is nasty, brutish, and short, red in tooth and claw. So sort of like utopia and dystopia have their Greek words in good place and bad place, the opposite of euangelion, evangelism, spreaders of good news, would be disangelion, disangelism, spreaders of bad news. And why the urge to be a disangelist? What do you gain from it, even if what you're saying is true? You've supposedly discovered that life is pointless, but what's the point in advertising that? Obviously, I understand disangelism for practical reasons for Alex. It's how he makes his money, but I don't understand it for rational or moral reasons. And I'm not saying this in theory. Even when my agnosticism was at its strongest, I never dreamed of actively spreading my doubts to others. My existential crisis was uncomfortable enough, and I remained skeptical even within atheism, always asking, what if I'm wrong? Which Alex also claims to be doing. So the whole idea of having an atheist platform is strange to me, and I'm going to unpack just how strange it is for Alex in particular when we talk about morality in a moment, because I think for him, based on his ethical system, his entire platform is self-defeating. But for now, let's make one final point of clarification on the burden of trust. Keep in mind that when you're placing these kinds of bets, the amount of risk is evaluated on two fronts. One, how likely is it that the risk will occur? And two, how severe is the risk? So if I grab onto a rope and know it has a 50% chance of breaking, and if it breaks I will fall 3 inches to the floor, I might grab on and give it a try. However, if I know it has a 25% chance of breaking, but if it breaks I will fall 3 miles onto a concrete slab, I won't even think about it. But notice the risk likelihood was cut in half, whereas the risk severity was drastically increased. This illustrates the principle that as the severity of the risk increases, a rational person's tolerance for its likelihood will decrease. The person who grabs that rope over a 3-mile drop is not in their right mind. Here today we're talking about atheism versus Christianity, which means the stakes are infinitely high. eternal. Now, some atheists might hear this and say, fine, I assert that you should worship the flying spaghetti monster and you'll go to hell if you don't believe me. Now what? And if someone asked me that, I would say, show me your evidence. Christianity isn't the only worldview presenting high stakes and serious consequences. I'm violating all sorts of Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu laws that would land me in some serious trouble if they're right. That's why I investigated all those religions and read their holy books along the way. So if you'd like to offer me a new worldview centered on unicorns or flying spaghetti monsters or Carl Sagan's aliens, then show me your evidence and I'll decide if it holds a candle to the evidence supporting Christianity. So to wrap up this section, you can try and frame the argument around burden of proof in order to evade evidence, but we all make decisions about how to live our lives under the burden of trust. Dangling over eternity, we grab onto some rope and hope it can hold our weight. We don't have a choice. We can try to shift the burden of proof, but no one avoids the burden of trust. And if the rope you're holding onto relies on materialist assumptions, you're out of your mind if you don't feel the need to seek out evidence to support those assumptions. That rope isn't nearly as strong as you may think. But we've been framing the debate long enough. Let's actually examine the evidence. First, let's survey the major arguments supporting Christianity and see how Alex handles them. After that, we'll proceed into his positive attacks on Christianity. And the first argument we're going to talk about is the cosmological argument, and specifically the Kalam cosmological argument, which has been best developed by Christian philosopher William Lane Craig. And here's how it goes. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. This argument is logically sound, meaning the conclusion does follow from the premises, so to undermine the argument, you have to undermine one of its premises. Otherwise, it holds up. And when it holds up, that leads to a next stage where we try and discern what features that kind of universal cause would need to have. Personal, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, powerful, etc. But since Alex doesn't interact with this next stage, we're not going to get into it here. The bulk of the debate around the Kalam has been on premise 2, that the universe began to exist. For instance, many atheist scientists were very displeased last century to find all the evidence pointing to our universe having a beginning. That wasn't a good look for atheism. And so they mounted a significant assault on Big Bang cosmology, trying to prove that there was no such beginning, but they failed. The Big Bang theory remains strong today. Since then, scientists have offered various hypotheses that propose models of cyclic universes, such as one that expands and contracts repeatedly, eternally. But none of them have convincingly evaded the second law of thermodynamics, which gives us strong reason to think that our universe is headed irreversibly toward heat death, entropy, barren, lifeless wasteland. So these cyclic hypotheses are not strong, and since Alex gives them virtually no attention, again, neither will I. The most popular atheist explanation for why our universe began to exist is the multiverse. In Alex's words, the Big Bang isn't said to be the beginning of the universe. It's just the beginning of everything we know of. In other words, there may be universes out there the scientists just haven't observed yet. I do commend atheists here on their faith in the unseen. I certainly don't have that much faith myself. The multiverse hypothesis is plausible, I suppose, but I'm not betting my life on it. Stephen Hawking was a major proponent of the multiverse hypothesis, and at the beginning of his book, A Brief History of Time, he tells the story of a scientist giving a lecture on the Earth orbiting the sun. And a little old lady stands up at the end and says, "That's all rubbish. The world is a flat disk supported on the back of a giant tortoise." And the scientist smugly asks, "What's the tortoise standing on?" "Very clever, young man," says the lady. "It's turtles all the way down." I love that story. Anytime a Christian asks, where did our observable universe come from? It had a beginning. It had to come from somewhere. Many atheists will say, "Very clever, Mr. Christian, but it's universes all the way down." Yeah, the idea of an infinite regress does sound pretty absurd if you think about it, and in fact there are strong philosophical reasons for thinking an infinite regress is actually impossible. And we see those arguments being made, perhaps most famously with Aristotle's unmoved mover, long before Big Bang cosmology confirmed the beginning of our observable universe. To date, no scientific evidence whatsoever has given us reason to doubt that the universe has a beginning, even if that universe happens to be a multiverse. But the multiverse hypothesis itself is only a hypothesis. It doesn't have nearly the evidentiary support to be anything more than that. So if you're going to bet your life on an infinite regress of universes, just be aware that you're betting on a hypothesis that is both philosophically dubious and supported by sparse scientific evidence. It's what you might call blind faith. Now, Alex actually talked to William Lane Craig about this very thing, and he didn't really put up a fight here. He threw a few hypotheticals at Craig, but none of them could bridge the gap between a theoretical infinite regress and one that's possible in the real world. So interestingly, Alex actually launches his main attack against the Kalam on the first premise, which is that which begins to exist has a cause. To challenge this, he first walks us through the fallacy of composition, which is that statements about the parts of some whole aren't necessarily true about the whole. For example, it may be true that all the bricks in some wall are small, but that doesn't mean the wall itself is small. Sometimes the parts have a feature that the whole doesn't have. This thinking has some problems, the most obvious problem being that it fails to distinguish between inductive reasoning and a compositional fallacy. All of science is based on inductive reasoning. We observe the physical world, we discern laws and principles from what we observe. That's how science is done.
Did I just hear that right? We discern laws and principles from what we deserve. Yeah, I meant to say observe. We discern laws and principles from what we observe. Wow. Anyway, you may now facepalm. I know I am. And I'll now return you to your regular scheduled program.
So I would be curious where Alex draws the line between induction and composition fallacy. But really that's all a red herring, because he then goes on to state that nothing within our observable universe begins to exist, at least not in the same way that our universe did. Everything after the Big Bang is just rearrangements of existing materials. Only at the beginning did anything truly come into existence, because only then did it come into existence out of nothing. Nothing else since then has done that. So really, he didn't need the whole fallacy of composition bit, because in his view, the universe is the only thing that's ever begun to exist. So in his view, there's actually no shared trait between the whole and its parts. Now, you may be wondering whether Alex's view here is a fringe view in the philosophical community. Yes. So, Alex argues it's possible that our universe just has a certain pop uncaused into existence out of nothing quality to it. Maybe that's what a universe is. It's a thing that just creates itself out of nothing and for no reason. In reply, I offer this quote that has been often attributed to G.K. Chesterton, but in fact appears to have popped into existence out of nothing, he actually said. And it goes like this: "A man who won't believe in God will believe in anything." Before we conclude our discussion on the cosmological argument, I should point out that if the God of Christianity created the universe out of nothing, that wouldn't just explain the Big Bang, we would expect it. So at this stage, I don't believe Alex has done much damage to Christianity, but we still have lots of ground to cover, so let's continue. The next major argument for Christianity is the teleological argument, the argument from design, and the main thrust of the argument is straightforward. Our universe and many things within it exhibit significant complexity and functionality. When we see other complex and functional things, we assume they were designed. Therefore, our universe was probably designed. Philosopher William Paley famously argued it this way: if you come upon a watch lying on the ground, you will observe its complex parts working together and functioning toward a purpose, to tell time. It will be rational of you to conclude that someone designed the watch for that purpose. Relatedly, it would be irrational to think a mindless series of accidents put the watch together. But how much more functional and complex is our universe than a watch? I can't think of a man-made machine as elegant or complex as an atom or a strand of DNA or the human brain. And I should point out here that the only one of those three you could try and push off on a natural selection would be the human brain. Atoms and DNA had to exist as prerequisites for natural selection to even get started. So if I look at a simple machine such as a watch and rationally conclude that it was designed, I will be no less rational to look at this universe, teeming with far greater functionality and complexity, and conclude the same. Now, there are several variations of this, but the overall idea is that the more you evaluate the various physical laws that comprise our reality, the more incredible it becomes to think it all happened by accident. It's especially striking how that if we modified certain laws, like the strength of gravity, by the tiniest fraction, the entire system collapses. But gravity is only one of numerous, finely tuned constants that make life possible, which is why it's often scientists especially who are persuaded by this argument. They've seen how the machinery works. Like Francis Collins, the Christian scientist who directed the Human Genome Project, talking about the intricate complexity of the human genome and how that machinery points to a designer. The main idea here is that the more science advances, the more apparent design becomes. Now, Alex has continuously acknowledged that this is a compelling argument. Most recently, in his conversation with Francis Collins last month, he said, "Of course it's compelling. It's a great mystery and an amazing finding that if we were to adapt these values, then nothing could exist." But then, acknowledging this, he goes on to challenge the argument with a couple of strange arguments. His first challenge is, if it's true that any slight variation in these constants would buck the system, doesn't that mean God is constrained by these constants? Now, I have to admit, I'm not sure what the point of this question is. It's very strange to me. It's like, here's a watch. Its complex parts function to tell time, but look, if you remove this gear, then the watch stops working. Therefore, the designer couldn't have built an airplane. What? The fact that changing our current universal constants would buck the system has nothing to do with whether God could have made a totally different system. Nor does any of this alter the common sense intuition that complex functional machinery doesn't design itself. It's a glaring non sequitur, so I'm just not sure what he's getting at here. But I will remind you that you're allowed to use your common sense. His second argument goes like this. The fine-tuning of the universe is actually evidence against the creator wanting there to be life. Otherwise, he would have made it easier for life to form. By way of analogy, he asks us to imagine that we draw at random from a bag of balls. One purple, lots of yellow. And if you draw the purple ball and ask yourself, what's the favorite color of the person who gave me this bag? You think their favorite color is purple. But once you discover that the bag is full of yellow balls, perhaps you'll change your mind. And here he invokes the idea of a creator and a sub-creator. The creator makes everything but doesn't want life. The sub-creator defies the first creator and designs life anyway, against the first creator's wishes. And Alex claims this is a better explanation of how our universe came to be than the loving Christian God. As in, like the yellow balls, God's favorite state of affairs must not have been life, otherwise he wouldn't have made life so improbable. Well, first let's modify the hypothetical. Let's say I'm blindfolded and I walk down a row of 5 buckets and each contains 1,000 balls. We can name the buckets after some of the universal constants that make life possible in our universe. Gravity, electromagnetic force, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, and cosmological constant. So I blindly grab a ball from one bucket at a time, and then at the end I have 5 purple balls in my hand, but then I found out that each bucket contained only 1 purple ball and 999 yellow ones. If that happens, my first question is not going to be, I wonder what the person's favorite color is. My first thought is going to be, wow, that was really improbable. Surely it wasn't just dumb luck. Of course, this analogy breaks down since there should actually be a lot more bags and enough balls in each one to fill up a stadium, but honestly, even if each bag contained only 2 balls, giving me a 50-50 chance of grabbing purple, I'd still begin questioning things if I grabbed the purple ball 5 times in a row. So, yet again, I'm not actually sure what Alex's point is here or how his hypothetical is supposed to show that a designer is less likely. These bizarre hypotheticals seem to be some kind of odd attempt at bypassing the question altogether. The fact that there are 1,000 ways to break a watch or make it incorrectly doesn't mean the watch's designer had some secret wish that it wouldn't work, and it certainly doesn't make it more likely that the watch built itself. But hey, who knows? Maybe God designed our universe so intricately to, put his power and brilliance on display and make it obvious that he made it. That seems like a much more obvious and probable inference, so I'm not sure why we're doing all these mental gymnastics and contorting ourselves around common sense. You really are allowed to use your common sense. So for now, when I see something complex and functional, I'm going to continue assuming that it was designed that way. Alex's constrained God and bag of balls haven't made me think it's time to reject that common sense inference. And I will conclude this section by pointing out that if the infinitely wise and creative God of Christianity exists, this doesn't just explain the intricate fine-tuning of our universe. We expect it. The next arguments we'll consider are the moral argument and the argument from reason. And I'm lumping these arguments together because they run along a similar pattern. The overall question is, how do we account for certain experiences that we have and that everyone around us seems to have? We're conscious, rational beings, and we have deep moral intuitions, a deep sense of right and wrong. And all of that feels very objective to us, and these qualities seem uniquely human. We see some altruistic behaviors in the animal kingdom, but nothing approaching the rigorous moral standards that seem to govern humanity. And not just humanity in relation to each other, but even in relation to creatures that don't share our genes or even species. For example, if you happen upon someone who, just for fun, is trying out all the different ways there are to skin a cat, you don't just think they're evil in a sort of cold philosophical sense. You feel repulsion to your very core, and when you try to put words to that experience, the word evil is just the best you can come up with. It's like the demon in C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy dismembering animals for fun and the sheer revulsion a morally sane person will feel while reading that. But it's not immediately obvious why we would have evolved to care what happens to other animals. I mean, if a chimpanzee watched a cat being skinned alive, I suspect all it would be thinking is, I wonder if they're going to let me eat that when they're finished. So there are some interesting arguments to be had here, but the overall question is, what better accounts for our reason and morality? Are these emergent properties of a mindless, unguided process, or are they features of being made in the image of God? And let me point out that even if we grant natural selection as the origin of reason and morality at the broadest level, there remain some striking mysteries within that framework, such as why did certain stages of evolution happen so impossibly fast, like the Cambrian explosion, almost as if someone just hit the fast forward button? Or for a really striking mystery, how did mindless stuff just wake up one day and become conscious? We haven't figured out how to design a computer that's conscious yet, and we're trying to do it on purpose. But there's no clear path we can see to making matter aware of its own existence, to giving matter a sense of self. So how is it that matter accidentally became conscious and self-aware? It's such a mysterious leap from a sophisticated system, like a modern computer, to a self-aware system, like a human being. So we're not just talking about a difference in degree, a simple increase in complexity. We're describing a difference in kind, a leap from non-conscious to conscious, and we have no clear sense of when or how that happens. So again, we're examining two competing answers to the question of where consciousness, reason, and morality might have come from. A, Christianity is true, and these are features of being made in God's image, or B, materialism is true, and these are evolutionary adaptations designed to give our genes a survival advantage. Alex, of course, takes the latter view, and to his credit, he therefore recognizes that this makes his morality entirely subjective. He calls himself an ethical emotivist, which means morals are expressions of emotion. Good is our way of expressing yay, evil is our way of expressing boo. Alex's words, not mine. So to establish his moral system, he grounds it in pleasure and suffering. Goodness is to increase pleasure and decrease suffering. Evil is the opposite. It is to increase suffering and decrease pleasure. Now, yet again, I'm not super clear on his position here because he makes a lot of rational philosophical arguments to the effect that we should have certain moral feelings, say about the cruelty of factory farming because it unjustifiably increases the suffering of certain animals. But then when we actually define our moral intuitions, they're just expressions of emotions we already have built into us by evolution. So he says our morals are just expressions of emotion, but then he rationally decides on a moral system that increases pleasure and decreases suffering. Therefore, we should all adopt the same moral system, which implies that we don't already have it or that there's some kind of overarching moral standard here. The point is, I don't quite get where he's bridging the gap between our moral emotions and our attempts to rationally tinker with those emotions. On a related point, I can't really see on his view where suffering leaves off and evil begins, since evil is a moral concept implying deviation from some standard, but suffering is morally neutral. Somewhere in this, he also draws a distinction between humanity and the other animals and claims we are the only moral agents, as in the only ones capable of doing good or evil, but I'm not sure why he thinks so. And I'm especially not sure why I should accept his moral system as opposed to, say, the one outlined in Nietzsche's The Antichrist, where goodness is redefined as power and evil as weakness, and the powerful should be crushing the weak on the way to superhumanity. Once we're allowed to redefine good and evil, why is Nietzsche's moral landscape any worse than Alex's? What standard are we using to choose between moral systems? It can't be a moral standard because that's the very thing we're trying to figure out. But then it's a bit odd to call it a rational standard since morality is seen as an evolved expression of emotions, though I suppose we could do a sort of moral CBT and decide the direction we want to go and then try to force our moral emotions to step in line with what we decide, but then we're getting circular because it's not clear why we'd choose any particular direction over any other, except perhaps that one feels better and then we're back to emotions running the show. Where does it all end? None of this necessarily weakens Alex's attack on Christianity except in showing that he's offering quite an anemic moral system to replace the rigorous Christian ethic of unconditional, selfless love for every person. That said, there is a very important question Alex hasn't answered concerning his moral views. In one debate concerning whether atheism can justify human rights, his opponent asked an interesting question. Why would someone with a moral system that's based on increasing pleasure and decreasing suffering set out to dismantle religion? Numerous studies have shown that religion, prayer, church-going, and so on are powerful tools for improved mental health, defeating addiction, increased life expectancy, altruism, better sex life, the list goes on. So even if we assume atheism, we still have strong reason to believe that religion overall increases people's pleasure and decreases their suffering. When this was pointed out to Alex, he just kept saying, well, I can't force myself to believe, even if believing would be good for me. I can't force myself to do it. But that doesn't get to the heart of the question. It's not, why haven't you forced yourself to believe? It's why are you actively spreading your lack of belief? That's the question. Why actively promote atheism if the basis of your moral theory is to increase pleasure and decrease suffering? Doesn't that make your entire atheistic platform immoral by your own ethical standards? You either have to disagree with the mountains of empirical evidence showing religion to be good for people, or you have to explain why you're okay with spreading beliefs that diminish people's well-being. So, while his ethical system doesn't give me very strong foundations for choosing his system over any other, it does give him very strong grounds for deleting his channel. I don't think he's going to do that, so let's compare the foundations of our moral systems. On the Christian worldview, morality is rooted in God's personality and preferences. If we have a strong resistance to injustice, violence, the suffering of the poor and oppressed, that's because we're made in the image of the God who told his people countless times throughout the Old and New Testaments to detest and oppose those things. If we have strong moral feelings about inflicting suffering on animals, that's because we're in the image of the God who commanded his people to oversee creation and see to the needs of their animals, and who predicted a time when predator and prey would coexist in harmony and there would be no killing, even in the animal kingdom. In fact, the people and the animals described in paradise in Genesis were all vegetarian. It's only after the fall that any kind of meat eating is introduced, which implies that meat eating is not ideal and is only a feature of the fall. So at the bookends of the Bible, there are paradises where there's no killing whatsoever, even in the animal kingdom. Conversely, on Alex's materialist assumptions, morals are evolved emotional expressions, and although he would prefer that we adopt his pleasure-based moral system, he hasn't offered any reason to prefer that system over any other. He hasn't shown where suffering gives way to moral evil, and he hasn't shown how his entire atheist platform isn't a violation of that very moral system that he's promoting. But the real question is, has Alex shown that materialism offers a better, more probable account than Christianity for how we came to be conscious, rational, moral beings? No. He just nods to natural selection and says it makes sense to him that all these extraordinary qualities would emerge unguided out of that process. It seems dubious to me, but what else can be said here? At some point, the evidence is on the table, and you just have to decide what seems more probable. That said, even if we grant that a simple nod to natural selection is good enough, all Alex has done is open the floodgates to moral chaos without offering any safeguards, perhaps because on atheism those safeguards simply don't exist. That would explain why the Nazis, who championed Nietzsche's atheistic ideas, and Lenin's scientific atheist party built out of Marx's atheistic ideas, and multiple other iterations of atheist Marxist governments have been so cruel and murderous. Unlike Christianity, you don't have to misuse atheism to arrive at such moral insanity. Some of atheism's best thinkers paved the way for it. But that doesn't make atheism less likely to be true, it just makes atheism awfully, to put it in Alex's words, boo. Before we conclude this section, I should point out that if we are made in God's image and tasked with loving one another and with overseeing creation, including the animal kingdom, that doesn't just explain our innate moral instincts, we expect them. We now arrive at the final Christian argument, which is really a family of arguments centered on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Standing at the center of all human history is this extraordinary man named Jesus. Centuries of Jewish prophecies lead up to his life. The book of Isaiah, written hundreds of years before Jesus walked the earth, contains several striking predictions. In chapter 7, it says, "The Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel." Emmanuel means God with us. In chapter 50, it describes one with godlike powers, even to command the elements, but he submits himself to the, quote, sovereign Lord. It says, "I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting." And then Jesus is later described as commanding the elements, yet offering himself willingly to beating, slapping, mocking, and spitting. In chapter 53, Isaiah describes one who was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities, one who was assigned a grave with the wicked, yet after he has suffered he will see the light of life. So it describes a brutal death followed by a resurrection. In Psalm chapter 22, which Jesus quoted from the cross, was also written hundreds of years before he walked the earth, and it describes one being brutalized and having their hands and feet pierced, even though there's no reason the Jews of that time should have had any sense of what a Roman crucifixion entailed, seeing that it wasn't happening yet. But these are just a few of numerous Old Testament passages that seem to describe Jesus' life with striking detail hundreds of years before he showed up. The entire Old Testament, beginning immediately after the fall, looks forward to this extraordinary offspring of Eve arriving to crush Satan. When you read the Old Testament start to finish, so much of it points to this child of heaven who's coming to save everyone. You finish the Old Testament with this strong sense of anticipation. When is he coming? And then Jesus shows up. And the first thing you notice about him is that his teaching is extraordinary. Unlike anything you'll read anywhere else in all the greatest literature, practically every sentence that comes out of Jesus' mouth is layered with brilliance. I mentioned a moment ago that he quoted Psalm 22 from the cross, which you'll find in Mark and Matthew. And that's a perfect example. Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is the first line of Psalm 22. The psalm that prophetically describes a brutal crucifixion, but ends with this triumphant line: "Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it." So from the cross, Jesus expresses his suffering with this heavy line: "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And yet he is simultaneously quoting a prophecy that ends in victory for all future generations. Another great example is when Jesus famously says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Most people think of this as a simple claim to be the highest authority, but on investigation we find it may well be deeper than that. I've heard it said that the East gave us spirituality and the West gave us rationality and the Middle East gave us revelation, which, whether or not that sweeping generality holds, you do read a foundational text for Eastern spirituality like the Tao Te Ching and learn about the Tao, a word that means road or path but is used to describe a deeper way of the universe. And then you read foundational texts for Western rationality like the works of Plato and Aristotle and see this rigorous emphasis on truth and reason and knowledge. And then Jesus shows up and claims not just to know, but to be, to embody the way, the Tao, from Eastern spirituality, and the truth so revered by the West, and everything revelation from heaven could offer, eternal life. He is the way, the truth, and the life, the embodiment of everything a person needs, mind, body, and spirit. And these are just two examples of something that happens over and over again. These seemingly mundane statements by Jesus can be unpacked into these little multifaceted gems, which is exactly what I would expect if he really is the embodiment of divine wisdom and creativity. And finally, we have the historical evidence that after Jesus was crucified and buried, he rose from the dead and presented himself to his followers. And a few facts in particular are overwhelmingly accepted by New Testament scholars, even the ones who don't believe the resurrection is the best explanation of those facts. It's widely accepted that Jesus was crucified and laid in a tomb, that his tomb was found empty by a group of his female followers, that multiple people in different circumstances believed they saw him risen from the dead, and that in the wake of these supposed appearances, Christianity explodes onto the scene and grows rapidly, even as Rome and the Jews are trying to violently stamp it out. If we take these resurrection facts, which historians regard as virtually airtight, and consider them in light of the prophecies predicting the coming of the Emmanuel, God among us, whose wounds will heal us, and if we consider all of that in light of his extraordinary life and teaching, what we find is a coherent account of God revealing himself to humanity and giving us a mountain of evidence to prove it's really him at work in all of this. So Alex needs to deal with Jesus, since Jesus is a linchpin for this whole debate. If Jesus really is the Son of God, then Christianity is true, and all the other arguments that we've covered so far, although worth considering, take a back seat to this central claim. And of course it follows that if Jesus really is the Son of God, then God exists, because God can't have a son if he doesn't exist. So then, how does Alex tackle the resurrection? His main attack is to point out supposed contradictions or errors in the gospel. For instance, was Jesus crucified before or after the Passover? Alex claims the synoptic gospels say it was before, but John says it was after, so which one is it? But on what basis does Alex make this claim? Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, describe Jesus eating the Passover meal with his disciples before his crucifixion, yet John says he was crucified on the day of preparation of the Passover, implying the Passover meal hasn't been eaten yet. Voila! Contradiction. To answer this contradiction claim, let's begin by putting all the evidence on the table, which Alex chose not to do. First, all four Gospels state that Jesus was killed on the day of preparation, which is always a Friday. And all four describe him eating something very similar to a Passover meal right before that. So what's the timeline here? On the day we now call Palm Monday, Jesus makes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This is the day of the Passover week when a lamb would be selected for slaughter. In this case, the lamb was Jesus, and this lamb walked voluntarily to its slaughter, exactly the way Isaiah described hundreds of years before it happened. A few days later, on Thursday, the evening before the typical Passover meal, Jesus has a special pre-crucifixion meal with his disciples. The next day is Friday, which is the day of preparation for that Passover week, and that's the day Jesus is killed. And he just so happens to be killed right around the time everyone in the city is slaughtering their Passover lambs. For some context, the Passover in the Old Testament dates back to the Israelites in Egypt, killing lambs with no blemish and wiping their blood over the doorposts so that the angel of death would pass over their house and not harm anyone inside. Thousands of years later, flawless Jesus voluntarily offers his blood as the ultimate sacrifice. And again, the words, "By his wounds we have been healed," are written hundreds of years before it happens. So here we have this remarkably coherent story, predicted hundreds of years beforehand by multiple prophets across multiple generations, and all marked by beautiful symbolism, and Alex just reads it and goes, "Aha! But they ate the Passover before the Passover. Contradiction. The whole story is false." You know what happens when attorneys act like this when presenting their case to the jury? The jury rolls its eyes, and then that attorney loses. Another supposed error that Alex frequently brings up is when the writer of Matthew refers to a prophecy about Jesus that says, "He will be called a Nazarene," but this prophecy is found nowhere in the Old Testament. So, Alex argues, the gospel writer either made that up or got it wrong, but either way, our infallible Bible isn't looking so infallible after all. You may find this surprising, but Alex is misrepresenting the evidence again. That Nazarene prophecy is found in Matthew chapter 2, and if you read the whole chapter, you'll notice 3 other prophecies, all 3 of which are attributed to a singular prophet, and the third one is even attributed directly to the prophet Jeremiah. This Nazarene prophecy, on the other hand, is preceded by the phrase, "So it was fulfilled what was said through the prophets," plural. That's a hint that we aren't quoting a specific prophecy. We're summarizing a prophetic theme, of which there are plenty. Within that framework, a few themes become available, but the most popular one that biblical scholars point to is this. Multiple prophets describe the coming Messiah as someone despised and rejected and not much to look at. The Nazarenes of Jesus' day were also despised. For instance, in the Bible, when Nathanael learns that Jesus is from Nazareth, he says, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" So in the lingo of the first century, the prophets did say Jesus would be a Nazarene, a despised and rejected person that we don't expect much from at first glance. That's easy enough. But are you noticing a trend here? Alex's favorite contradictions don't persuade me that the Bible is unreliable, but they do persuade me that Alex is unreliable. He's reading these passages the way you would expect if your only agenda is to debunk what you're reading. But you know what? Let's just grant all of his contradictions arguendo for a moment. Let's say the Gospels do disagree on whether the crucifixion happened before or after the Passover. Let's say Matthew quoted a false prophecy about Nazarenes. Let's say the flight to Egypt was deceptively shoehorned into the Gospels to fulfill prophecies that Jesus didn't actually fulfill. Would this affect any of the major facts mentioned earlier? Would we doubt the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the belief by Jesus' followers that they saw him risen, the explosive rise of Christianity? No. You still have to deal with all of that. Non-Christian historians approach the Gospels assuming there will be legendary embellishments in there, but they still don't deny these core facts. But maybe Alex just thinks that if he can establish some contradictions, then he's destroyed the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. Well, he hasn't. Biblical scholars don't view inerrancy in such a rigid, literalistic way. Check out the links below for a few examples. But the basic idea is that Christians take the Bible as a reliable, authoritative map toward the real and living God. We don't worship the Bible. We worship the God that it reliably points to. Jesus told the misguided religious leaders of his day, "You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, but it is they that testify about me. Yet you refuse to come to me and have life." On a similar theme, Paul wrote, "The letter kills, but the spirit gives life." And given the innate limitations of language to perfectly convey a person's experience, this makes sense. So Bible worship is unbiblical, which means that even if Alex could establish some petty contradictions in there that don't affect the core narrative in the slightest, and I don't think he's even done that much, he would still need a lot more than that to undermine the foundations of the Christian worldview. Unlike his moral philosophy, it's not a house of cards, and if you want to tear down a fortress, you'll need to undermine its foundation, not just chip a few pebbles off the outer wall. On a practical note, these attacks on supposed contradictions can be tricky, especially in a debate setting, because the atheist may show up with 10 supposed contradictions in his pocket. There are atheist websites that claim to list thousands, and you might knock down 2 or 3, but the moment they bring up one you're unfamiliar with, it's, "Aha, you can't defend the Bible, you lose." Now, in my profession, If you show up to court with a brand new argument that the other side hasn't had a chance to research and respond to, that's an ethical violation and you get sanctioned for gamesmanship because the goal is justice and a fair analysis of the evidence, not victory despite the evidence. So just keep in mind that cheap tactics like this may lead to some cute mic drop moments, but they are no threat to the Christian worldview. Once the gamesmanship is passed and you get a chance to review the evidence, you'll find Christianity is still perfectly strong. So much for contradictions. Another way Alex tries to undermine the resurrection is by claiming there's no extra-biblical evidence outside the Bible to show that Jesus' followers were willing to die for him after the resurrection. Alex says only 2 deaths of eyewitnesses are featured in the Bible, one of which is Judas, and the remaining martyrs he pushes off on church tradition. Now, Alex is just flat wrong on this point, and he grossly oversimplifies the analysis. For example, let's consider 2 apostles, Peter and Bartholomew. Peter's martyrdom is not in the Bible, but it is predicted in the Bible, and it's evidenced by at least 8 extra-biblical sources. 2 of those sources, Clement and Ignatius, are what's called apostolic fathers, meaning they lived at the same time as the apostles and likely knew them firsthand. The martyrdom of Bartholomew, on the other hand, doesn't enter the Christian tradition till many years later, and its historical value is tainted with legendary embellishment. An honest, nuanced reading of this historical evidence will grant significantly more probability to the martyrdom of Peter as opposed to Bartholomew, and you can think of them as opposing ends of a spectrum. Some of the martyrs, like Paul and the 2 Jameses, are backed by strong historical evidence. Some of the others are weaker, but either way, we have strong reason to believe that multiple apostles suffered tremendously and ultimately died for the claim that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. And where the evidence falls silent, we certainly have no reason to conclude that the remaining apostles were any different from the ones we do know about, nor that any of them cast any doubt on the budding Christian movement. Quite the contrary. Christians are famously relentless by the time Pliny the Younger writes about them in 112 AD and Tacitus writes about them in 116. By their descriptions, you can torture a Christian in the most savage way and tell them that the only way they're getting out of this is to deny Christ, but those pesky superstitious Christians will still praise Jesus to their last breath. Now, what an honest, nuanced reading of the historical evidence won't do is push off all the martyrdoms into the uselessly broad and therefore misleading category of church tradition. But that's what Alex does. Indeed, I don't say this lightly, but Alex is worse than wrong here. In his 2019 debate with Jonathan McClatchy, Alex claimed there was no extra-biblical evidence for the disciples' martyrdoms, and McClatchy corrected him and pointed to some of the sources I just mentioned. 5 years later, Alex is still saying the same thing. I guess just in case his next opponent won't catch it. Yet again, in my profession, what he's doing is an ethical violation. If you know about some law that's unfavorable to your case but don't mention it to the court, you violate what's called the duty of candor to the tribunal. The thinking is, you're allowed to advocate for your side wholeheartedly, but you are not allowed to be purposely deceptive. This ethical rule is a way of making sure cases get resolved fairly, which means applying all the applicable law to all the relevant facts. Alex, on the other hand, is willing to regurgitate false or, at best, misleading claims to score points, proving that you have to be careful any time he makes a factual claim. It's quite possible that he's knowingly concealing evidence. Moving on, Alex's final attack on the resurrection is taken out of Bart Ehrman's playbook because he claims that the gospel stories about Jesus increase in their grandiosity and legendary embellishment the later they're written. Mark is the earliest gospel, so it supposedly never has Jesus claiming to be the Son of God and no post-resurrection appearances. John is the latest gospel, so it has the most extraordinary embellishments. The overall goal here is to paint Jesus as an apocalyptic preacher who believed the end was near but never claimed to be the Son of God or the Messiah. The whole messianic Son of God thing they suggest was a later legendary development. And here, worse than ever, Alex is grossly overstating his case. One of the earliest books in the Bible is Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which is composed within 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion and includes a formulaic summary of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and post-resurrection appearances, all of which are framed as the fulfillment of Old Testament messianic prophecies. Biblical scholars estimate that this formula Paul quotes dates to within a couple of years, if not months, of Jesus' crucifixion. Way too early for so many supposed legendary embellishments to muddy the testimony, since those kind of embellishments and other sources are shown to form over centuries, not months. Paul's letter to the Corinthians also predates the Gospel of Mark, which completely defeats any claim that Jesus was morphed into the Messiah over time as legends around him evolved. Yet again, all of this was pointed out to Alex years ago, and his reply was, yeah, but 1 Corinthians isn't one of the Gospels. So I guess in his most extraordinary feat of biblical scholarship yet, Alex puts the Gospel writers in a vacuum and totally divorces them from the other Christian writing and testimony that was circulating in the same area at the same time. But okay, let's exclude 1 Corinthians from the pool of evidence and just focus on the Gospels. Mark is the earliest, and the Jesus of Mark is apparently being presented as nothing more than an apocalyptic preacher and not the messianic Son of God. Well, the very first sentence of the book of Mark says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. All right, but this isn't Jesus claiming to be the Son of God himself. It's just Mark writing that he's the Son of God. Maybe Mark just had a lot of self-control and didn't embellish the story despite his own personal beliefs. Well, we're still in the first chapter of Mark when the heavens are torn open and a voice from heaven says, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." But I guess Jesus still isn't calling himself the Son of God. Maybe he didn't believe the voice from the torn open heavens. We're still in the first chapter when a demon-possessed man sees Jesus and cries out, "Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus tells that demon to be quiet and cast it out of the person, then goes on to cast out several more demons and cures several illnesses and announces to his Jewish audience that the time is fulfilled, implying that all those Old Testament prophecies are about to come true, and he's announcing that the kingdom of God is at hand. That's all in the first chapter. And all throughout the book of Mark, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, which sounds a bit odd until you go read the Old Testament prophecy that one like a Son of Man would be given dominion and glory and a never-ending kingdom, and that people of every nation would serve him. Now, what I've just described to you is a tiny fraction of the evidence. So when atheists like Alex regurgitate this myth from Bart Ehrman that the Gospels paint an ever-evolving portrait of Jesus, there are a few rational responses available to you, but pulling from my legal expertise, I think the most rational response would be to first just facepalm and take as much time as you need on that. And then when you're finished, tell that person to take off their atheist-colored glasses before they run into a wall, and then go read the Gospels again. All right, enough of that. We're seeing how weak Alex's attacks are on the historicity of Jesus, but it's also unclear what happens if we assume, for the sake of argument, that all his attacks land. And the reason it's unclear is because he never actually takes a position. He just sort of throws rocks at the narrative, then claims the Christians got it wrong. But if I try to put myself in Alex's shoes and assume that all these contradictions really are contradictions and that the New Testament writers are actively inventing stories or they were deceived, and similarly that we have to disregard all Christian sources, both biblical and extra-biblical, as lying or deceived or legendary, I still have to explain the facts. And if I try to explain them while assuming that Alex is 100% correct, here's what I can come up with. The Old Testament predicts the coming of this Messiah figure who gets his hands and feet pierced for our transgressions, saves the world, rules an eternal kingdom, and then hundreds of years later, this Jesus shows up and offers some really interesting teaching and gets a following and gets himself crucified. And because he's such a great teacher, his followers either believe or invent a resurrection, even though no one else tried to do that with any of the other dozen or so self-proclaimed messiahs that cropped up in the same area and secured big followings around the same time. So then these uneducated cultists who follow Jesus go on to build a movement out of their lie or delusion or some mixture of the two, and within months of Jesus' death, they're clever and clear-headed enough to retroactively shoehorn their fake Messiah into several Old Testament messianic prophecies, some of which they point out while writing their false narratives, many others which readers have to work out on their own. Quite a deep con there. And speaking of deception, these Jesus people claim that Jesus called Satan the father of lies, and across the board they condemn lying as evil, but to build their Jesus movement, they make a lot of stuff up. Around the time that all of this is happening, Paul has some epileptic seizure or something that convinces him that he met Jesus in a totally different setting, or he makes it up. But either way, he throws away his cozy life of wealth and prestige in exchange for persistent hardships and imprisonment, and eventually death in service to this deceased Jesus figure. And so what begins with a celebrity preacher's execution ends with everything Christianity has become. Now, I'm an extremely skeptical person by nature, so I don't find this narrative very compelling, but again, I don't actually know what Alex thinks happened. He never says. The only thing he does repeatedly say is, I can't deny that something really weird happened on Easter. Yes, Alex, I think something really weird did happen, and I don't think it was just that a bunny laid eggs. But seriously, the evidence is strong enough that he'll say something weird happened, but don't these facts demand more of an explanation than that? Especially if you're setting yourself up as an alternative to Christianity. We have several facts on the table. Shouldn't you offer an alternative explanation of them? But it appears he just wants to hide behind the agnostic, I don't know, and wait till it's more convenient before he begins leaning wholesale on materialism again. So it's not just that Alex doesn't follow the evidence to where it leads, he doesn't follow it anywhere. He just throws rocks at it, finds it strong enough to support something really weird, and then shrugs off the whole thing and walks away. Of course, I can't blame any atheist for not trying to offer an alternative to the resurrection. Every alternative is easily dismissed when all the facts are on the table, and it's much easier to poke at existing structures than to try to build your own. And on that note, one point Alex likes to make after evaluating Jesus is that if the Christian story really were God's divine plan, Alex would have expected God to make it more obvious. So the story is predicted by multiple writers hundreds of years before it happens. And when it does happen, there are numerous eyewitnesses to all the major events. Much of that eyewitness testimony is almost immediately written down, and the number of manuscripts preserved from those accounts dwarfs any parallel history to a staggering degree, giving us unheard of historical backing, and every non-Christian attempt to explain this mountain of evidence sounds like it was written in crayon. Indeed, we have so much historical evidence around Jesus that someone might as well have followed him around with a video camera. Although, if the resurrection had been captured on video, Alex would just insist it was edited. Honestly, the only people I know who are more dogmatic than religious fundamentalists are atheist fundamentalists. But at any rate, Alex's argument here can be summarized as follows. If I were God, I would have made the evidence for Christianity stronger. Therefore, Christianity is false. And so we get our first and certainly not our last taste of what I like to call if I were God arguments, all of which are defeated by the obvious fact that you don't have any idea what you would do if you were God. More on that in a moment. For now, let's just observe that Alex has offered no explanation of the powerful historical evidence around Jesus. He just says something really weird happened. On the other hand, if Jesus really is the Son of God, and if his life, death, and resurrection really were part of God's long-standing plan to rescue humanity, this not only explains the prophecies, the brilliance of Jesus' teaching, and the mountains of historical evidence supporting Christianity. We expect these things. But at this point, we've only discussed a positive case for Christianity and how Alex responds to it. He doesn't seem to have done much damage, but maybe it's his positive attacks that prove the incoherence of Christianity, so let's turn to those. And his main attacks are the problem of evil. Why would a good God allow evil and suffering? And for Alex, that's with special emphasis on animal suffering. And then there's what I call the problem of God, focusing on God's behavior in the Old Testament that often shocks and upsets people, myself included. And then there's the problem of divine hiddenness. If God wants to be found, then why haven't I found him? So he must either not love me or not exist. Now, before we get into the meat of it, let's make some preliminary observations. For one, none of these arguments really attack God's existence. All of them are attacks on his goodness, so these arguments have no effect on anything we've discussed up to this point. The only real overlap is with the moral argument, but that's just because atheists rely so heavily on all the moral outrage we inherently feel about a lot of this, even though atheists have no rational basis for that feeling, whereas Christians do. Now, Alex's go-to response to this observation is that it's an internal critique, meaning I'm not saying these things are evil, I'm just saying they would be evil if Christianity were true, which is logically true, but it's not practically true. Alex knows that every morally sane person in the room feels exactly the same way that he does. So yes, while you're not logically stealing from Christianity to make your point, you are relying on moral instincts that your worldview does a very poor job of explaining, and in explaining them, opens them to revision a la Nietzsche. Christianity, on the other hand, explains these instincts very well. On a related note, these arguments don't stand in a vacuum. They address an entire worldview, so they don't just have to be strong, they have to be so strong that it would be rational to go back and accept materialist responses to all the prior arguments. Uncaused, self-designing universe, moral chaos, a really weird Easter, and all that. Another observation is that all of Alex's positive attacks on Christianity fit within a category I mentioned a moment ago. They're what I call if I were God arguments. And although they're all framed slightly differently, the same logic underlies all of them. And it goes like this. I can't understand why God would do things this way. Therefore, he must have no good reason for it. therefore he must not exist. Now, for one, this is obviously a non sequitur. I can't always reconcile the idea that God is love with certain harsh things he's done or allowed, but from this, all I can rationally conclude is that I don't fully understand him. If I go on to conclude that he therefore doesn't exist, I've gone too far. There are features of our universe that we currently can't reconcile, such as general relativity and quantum mechanics. And from this, again, I can rationally conclude that we don't fully understand our universe. But if I conclude that our universe therefore doesn't exist, I've gone too far. And if that's true for the universe, it will be a fortiori true of the God who made the universe. But aside from being a non sequitur, it's also just arrogant. If you assume arguendo the existence of the Christian God, this eternal, all-knowing being who designed atoms and galaxies and the human brain, who can closely monitor every single creature on the planet simultaneously, who sees our future even more clearly than we see our own past, why would we expect to comprehend him? He is way beyond us. But to bring things down to earth, here's an analogy I've heard for this. If a child sees someone sawing off a man's arm, and the one losing his arm is screaming out in pain, the child might think the one with the saw is a bad person. But if the child later learns that it was a doctor cutting off the arm to save their life, he might think, oh, the doctor was intentionally causing suffering, yes, but he was doing it to accomplish a greater good. So we do accept this pattern of causing suffering for some greater good, at least sometimes. The real question isn't whether it's morally permissible to cause suffering for a greater good. The question is when it's morally permissible. But let's add a layer to this. Imagine that I ask you for instructions on how to perform a brain surgery, and I mean specifically where to cut, which medications to use, post-surgery care, all of it. Or better yet, I ask you to perform the surgery yourself. The vast majority of people, if they attempt this, will kill the patient, and that's why we don't let them do brain surgeries. It's obvious that if God exists, the comprehension gap between me and a brain surgeon is dwarfed by the comprehension gap between anyone and God. So any argument that says, I won't believe in God till I understand why he does things, not till his ocean of wisdom fits inside my puddle-sized brain, you're already being irrational. Even if it's rational to believe in God, it's then equally irrational to think you'll comprehend him. So I'll try to answer Alex's if I were God challenges, but even if I can't, the fact that a 25-year-old atheist YouTuber or the greatest genius of all time can't think of why the Christian God might have done something isn't a threat to the Christian faith. Of all the times that an agnostic I don't know would be a rational response, attempts to work out why God might have done something should be at the top of that list. Even so, let's go ahead and address his challenges. And his main attack is the problem of evil, with special emphasis on animal suffering, which he calls Christianity's biggest problem. And as usual, the argument can be stated a few ways, but here's the gist of it. The Christian God is said to be perfectly loving and all-powerful. But if he were perfectly loving and all-powerful, he would not allow suffering to exist. Suffering does exist, therefore the Christian God doesn't. Of course, the Christian offers a handful of responses to this, but at the most general level, the response is that God, like our doctor a moment ago, causes or allows suffering if it will lead to some greater good. This pattern is one of the Bible's major themes, start to finish. You have the story of Joseph in Genesis. His brothers jealously sell him into slavery, and God uses this evil to rescue their entire family. At the center of the Christian story is the cross, where a perfectly innocent person is brutalized for crimes he didn't commit, and God uses this immense evil to save the world. And the Bible predicts that God will turn all evil into greater good in the end. For instance, Paul writes that our present suffering isn't worth comparing to the good that's to come. So within that overarching pattern of turning evil into greater goods, Christians will sometimes point out certain specific goods that come out of lesser evils. Soul-making, for example. Suffering, sort of like exercise, often strengthens the one who suffers. It sort of builds up their soul, and so it's worthwhile in the end. Another common example is free will. God chose to make creatures with the freedom to choose good or evil, the ultimate good being to love him, and because we're all made in his image, love each other. But that freedom means the possibility of evil. Now, one question Alex has asked a few times on this point is, what about free will in heaven? If free will necessitates the potential for evil, doesn't that mean that heaven will either not be free or will still include the potential for evil? But I don't think that's how it works. In Christianity, when the angels were standing face to face with God, it seems they had a sort of sterile, straightforward choice. Some chose to love and serve God, others turned against him. And now, whatever choices they make can only be made within the trajectory of that earlier choice. We see that pattern in normal life. You choose this job or college major or spouse or whatever, and those choices close off a huge list of opportunities while simultaneously opening a brand new set of opportunities. So now your next choices are made within the parameters of your prior ones. So it's not that you're not free in heaven, it's that you chose to love and trust God, and as an extension of that, love the people around you, and in heaven you live freely within the parameters of that choice. In short, Alex's objection to freedom in heaven holds no water, but his main response to the soul-making and free will defense is to shift the conversation to a specific type of suffering, animal suffering. And he points out that human free will and soul-making can't account for the gruesome brutality seen in the animal kingdom. And in fact, that brutality is how natural selection works. Kill or be killed is woven into the fabric of the whole process, and it was there long before humans were around to freely screw things up. Now, this is a good time to point out that there's a difference between evil and suffering, and on Alex's worldview, animal suffering is not evil, it's just a brute fact. On Christianity, however, Alex is viewing animal suffering as evil because God's allowing it to happen. But to reach this conclusion, he has to assume not just that God's allowing it to happen, but that he's allowing it for no good reason. And on that note, he'll say, I need you to give me a good reason why God would allow this, and if you can't, then Christianity fails. So I'll point out again that even if I can't give you a satisfactory answer to this question, this wouldn't threaten the rationality of Christianity because it never would have been rational for me to think I could always comprehend God's reasoning in the first place. I do intend to try and offer an explanation anyway, but first, Alex doesn't leave the argument here. He asks us to look at both worldviews, Christianity and atheism, and predict what we would expect to see if they were true. If the God of Christianity existed with all his power and love, would we expect all this gratuitous brutality in the world? According to Alex, no. On the other hand, he claims that all this brutality is not merely explained by atheism. On atheism, we expect it. One small note. To make his point, Alex has now made atheism synonymous with materialism. Recall from earlier when he wants to avoid the burden of proof, he claims atheism isn't a proposition, it's just a lack of belief, but atheism doesn't make any claims and therefore can be assumed without evidentiary support. But now, when talking about the problem of evil, he assumes materialism and atheism are one and the same, and even sometimes calls atheism a hypothesis, which is why he can say the brutality in the animal kingdom is expected on atheism. By atheism, he now means materialism, as in, it's become a positive claim, now that it's more convenient to use it that way. This subtle tactic is called moving the goalposts. It's the kind of thing you have to do if you can't win the match fair and square. Beyond that, there are some serious problems with this whole on atheism we expect this line. For one, God is not the only agent at work in Christianity, and you can't just stick him in a vacuum and ask what you'd expect if he were the only thing that existed. Christianity is an entire worldview, and if you're going to critique it, you can't cherry pick pieces of it. You have to take the whole package. So, of course there's human free will, but then there's also Satan and his devils who appear to have freely rejected God, and the Bible says they were cast to earth, and that there are good angels here as well, contending with the bad ones. So if we take Christianity as a whole, it's not difficult to imagine that the bad angels could have interfered with the entire process of bringing life to fruition here on earth, and that this sort of battleground place would show plenty of evidence that forces of good and evil are at work. Natural selection, for instance, is a brutal kill or be killed process, and yet all of these beautiful, majestic creatures emerge out of it. If God allowed the bad angels to interfere with natural processes, but he and his agents used all of that cruelty and violence to accomplish even greater goods, and even to symbolize with the natural world this persistent biblical theme of turning evil into an even greater good, that makes sense to me. The Bible even describes Satan as the god of this world, implying that he's been given a lot of freedom here. If that's true, it doesn't just explain the brutality we see around us, we come to expect it. Now, the atheist is free to say, well, I don't like that. If I were God, I wouldn't have done it that way. And that's fine, but their feelings don't make Christianity incoherent, although their strong, innate distaste for animal suffering does make zero sense within their worldview. On that note, let's review our expectations. On atheism, I expect nothing to exist. It's just an odd assumption that mindless, pointless stuff just happens to exist. But if there's a creator, I do expect things to exist. On atheism, if something does exist, I don't expect it to be exquisitely fine-tuned. If there's a creator, I do expect this. On atheism, if the universal constants are finely tuned, I still don't expect life to actually form because that's still highly unlikely even in a finely tuned universe. If there's a creator, I do expect life to form. On atheism, if some rudimentary form of life does show up, I don't expect it to ever approach anything like the complexity of DNA or the human brain. If there's a creator, I do expect this. On atheism, even if something that complex forms, I don't expect it to ever develop a sense of self and observe its own existence. But if we're made in the image of the original eternal self, I do expect this. On atheism, if matter does organize itself into a self-aware species via natural selection, I don't expect that species to feel such a repulsion to the suffering of other species that have nothing to do with its own survivability. But if I'm made in the Creator's image and tasked with caring for creation, I do expect this feeling. So before Alex can even get to his whole, we don't just explain the brutality, we come to expect it, he can only say that in the wake of a long list of assumptions that are very much not expected on atheism. Whereas, again, on Christianity, we also assume the brutality. We just add to that expectation that it will be set right in the end. So, has Alex shown Christianity to be incoherent via the problem of evil and animal suffering? No. Even when he was at his most persuasive, that was only because he got to rely on distinctly Christian emotions that his own worldview can't explain. Here, however, we do arrive at what, for me, when I was an atheist, was the most difficult problem with Christianity. And that's what I came to call the problem of God. That's the Canaanite conquest, especially the Amalekites, slavery, the taking of virgins as spoils of war, God directly killing several people, including the innocent and even children, all of that. The main thrust of the question is, why would God not merely allow, but command or directly inflict this kind of brutality? You don't get to blame human free will or Satan for this. God's doing it himself. As before, let's begin with some general points before moving into a specific response. And the first point is that I strongly dislike these passages, especially on a superficial reading. I can't always tell what God is up to, but it looks awfully harsh, and that makes me very uncomfortable. When I was an atheist, pretty much all Christian attempts to explain what God might have been thinking just made me mad and did the opposite of help their cause. And after converting to Christianity, I still found these passages embarrassing and uncomfortable. And of course, I still don't love them. That said, something else worth observing is that the Bible that includes these troubling passages is the same Bible that gives me by far the strongest philosophical basis for hating violence and oppression, the very instincts that make me dislike these passages so much. So we already have kind of a puzzle here. Something else to observe is that these passages, troubling as they are, clearly are not intended to be normative. There's no go therefore and do likewise mindset about them. On the other hand, when I read the Bible cover to cover, several persistent themes do emerge and they're present from start to finish. One of those themes is that violence is a terrible thing. In the story of Noah, the world is flooded because of rampant violence. King David, celebrated as he is told by God that he's not allowed to build the temple in Jerusalem because he has too much blood on his hands. Jesus tells his followers, put your swords away. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And in general, he promotes peaceful non-resistance. Countless passages in the Bible associate violence with evil. Another theme is anti-oppression. God's people are told over and over again, dozens if not hundreds of times, to stand up for the poor, the oppressed, the widow, the foreigner. So there's a definite theme of care for the poor and powerless that runs through the entire Bible. It's one of the most pervasive themes. That's why Nietzsche hated it so much. Another theme is the empowerment of women. That may be surprising to hear given the modern ill-informed caricatures of the text, but those caricatures are indeed ill-informed. There are several female prophets and leaders in the Old Testament and very countercultural protections for wives and women in general. Jesus had female disciples, which was a hugely controversial move in that patriarchal rabbinic culture that had such charming sayings as, it's better to burn the Torah than to read it to a woman. Paul, similarly, was very provocative and countercultural in his insistence that women be allowed to learn and take leadership in the church, and he did a lot of his ministry alongside strong women. Again, very unusual in his day. New Testament scholars are divided on what exactly Paul was getting at with those passages Alex likes to bring up about women being quiet or submissive, but they universally acknowledge that Paul, like Jesus, dignified women in significant countercultural ways. Taken in its proper context, the Bible is actually quite a feminist book, and not the cheap sexual liberation type of feminism from the 70s that just ends in a different kind of exploitation and led very naturally into the Me Too movement. No, Jesus and his people dignify women in ways that really count. Maybe that's why Christianity is so much more popular among women than men. But one final theme worth bringing up is the theme of self-sacrifice. God's people should, where possible, take on suffering themselves if it will be good for others. That's a theme that we see most clearly in the life, teaching, and brutal killing of Jesus himself. Now, putting all these themes together, most of them can be summarized this way. All people are made in God's image and should be dignified accordingly. Jesus says that whatever we're doing to others, we're doing to him. So treating people poorly or even simply neglecting them is tantamount to mistreating God himself. That's the kind of thinking that has provided the philosophical underpinning for history's greatest human rights movements and why our modern human rights are a heritage of the Judeo-Christian ideas of civil justice. When this was pointed out to Alex, he tried to claim that modern human rights are actually an inheritance of the Enlightenment. But as I alluded to earlier, post-Enlightenment atheism gave us Nietzsche and Marx, and the political regimes built out of their ideas alone, Nazism and various iterations of Marxism, are some of the most spectacularly cruel political regimes the world has ever seen. So yet again, Alex is just flat wrong here. Tom Holland, the agnostic who has studied this question in depth, made a strong case that the entire ethical framework we take for granted nowadays is a distinctly Judeo-Christian inheritance. If Alex wants to call Holland's research into question in any serious way, he's going to need more than a facile nod to the Enlightenment. That said, I will grant that the Enlightenment sharpened the contrast between atheism and Christianity. When the Enlightenment takes atheism to its logical conclusion, you get the Holocaust and murderous Marxism. And when the Enlightenment takes Christianity to its logical conclusion, you get human rights. But I'm digressing a bit. Why am I bringing up all these biblical themes? Because an intellectually honest reading of the troubling biblical passages that Alex brings up can only be done in light of the overarching biblical themes. If you extract and isolate these passages from their context, you're doing bad scholarship. For example, one of the passages Alex routinely brings up is Saul and the Amalekites. God tells Saul to wipe them out, men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Saul keeps some of the animals in the Amalekite king alive, which gets him punished by God. So Alex makes out Saul to be this sort of merciful martyr rejected by the evil dictator in the sky for refusing to enact such cruelty. This ignores the historical evidence that the men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys language was the kind of rhetorical, exaggerated language common at that time, akin to saying, wipe them off the face of the earth, and so it likely wasn't literal, a theory supported by the fact that the Amalekites were still around in later Bible stories. It also ignores that animals were a form of wealth at that time, so even if we took the rhetorical language literally, that means Saul killed the women and children but kept the wealth for himself. And the passage itself says Saul destroyed everything that wasn't worth keeping. So God didn't penalize Saul's mercy, he penalized his greed, which is further shown by the fact that Saul later goes into a town full of priests and out of anger and on his own volition killed everyone in the town, and we see the same language, men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys, only this time it's an act of personal vengeance. So Saul is not some merciful martyr, he's greedy and murderous. As we've seen Alex do several times by now, when he brings up this passage, he twists it into something very different from what it actually describes. But here's another example. Alex spends a lot of time talking about slavery in the Bible, especially in that foreign slaves in the Old Testament were supposedly treated like chattel, just like the more recent European slave trade. Of course, the word slave is a loaded term in the modern West after the European slave trade, which was dismantled by Christians for Christian reasons, but already we're emotionally loading our terms at the expense of precision. Much of what was called slavery throughout the history of the world has been something we see plenty of in our modern culture. There are owners and people who work for the owners, employers and employees, and throughout the history of the world, many variations of this arrangement were given the blanket term master and slave. But what we don't like is when employees have all their dignity stripped away, no rights, no freedom, and masters can do whatever they want to their slaves, no matter how brutal. That's when we get upset, and that's when we get in the neighborhood of the modern idea of slavery, and we don't like that. None of us do. But again, this is a distinctly Judeo-Christian distaste. In the Old Testament law, Israel is told, do not mistreat slaves and foreigners, but rather treat them like your own citizens and love them as yourself, because remember, you were once slaves and foreigners in Egypt. And then Jesus goes on to highlight this very concept as a central feature of the Christian ethos. He says the whole Christian moral system hangs on two commandments: love God with everything in you and love your neighbor as yourself. And when someone asks him what it means to love others as yourself, he provocatively describes a member of one of the Jews' most hated ethnic groups going out of his way to help a Jewish stranger in need. But even in the Old Testament, foreigners could climb the social ladder in Israel and even have Israelite slaves. Killing anyone, including a slave, was a capital offense, and if masters seriously injured their slaves, that slave's debt was instantly cleared and they were set free. In light of all of this, Alex spends a lot of time on the passage from Exodus that says, if you beat your slave with the rod and they die, then you must be punished, but if the slave gets up after a day or two, there's no punishment because the slave is your property. In other words, see, the Bible promotes cruelty to slaves. You can beat them to dust and get away with it. Now, for one, we've already gone over the fact that it is strictly against the Old Testament law to mistreat slaves and foreigners. You have to love them as yourself. So this has to be read within that framework. The culture is obviously very different from ours because parents are also described around the same time using rods on their own children as an act of loving discipline. So, of course, the idea of using a rod on anyone is shocking to us in an age when many believe even spanking your kids is a form of abuse, but as we keep seeing, it's very easy to misunderstand the cultural context that these passages are written out of. Moreover, there's another translation of this passage that is worth noting. It comes from Dr. Harry Hoffner, who's an expert in that ancient culture, and he notes that the word for property here is actually silver. So Dr. Hoffner thinks that this would be better read not that the slave is his property, but rather that it, as in the medical fee, is his silver. In other words, there's no need to punish the guy who negligently injures his slave because it's his silver covering the medical fee anyway. And if you're reading the passage in light of the overall framework that's highly protective of slaves and foreigners, this alternative reading makes sense. So when Alex asks, does the Bible condone slavery? There are a couple of ways to answer him. First, we can say, obviously not. It was biblical ideas that destroyed slavery. But second, the question is imprecise. The real question is, does the Bible give anyone grounds for dehumanizing, exploiting, or otherwise oppressing anyone? And the answer is, again, obviously not. No honest reading of the Bible will lead you to dehumanize even your worst enemy. On the other hand, you don't have to twist atheism to dehumanize or oppress others. Social Darwinism is built right in. But see, we're so deep in the weeds here, and these are just two of the most common ideas that Alex likes to bring up from the Old Testament. To unpack every single one would make this a 10-hour video, but these two alone give us enough to conclude at least one important thing. Alex routinely misuses the Bible without taking the time to understand it. His bias is never more clear than when he's dabbling in biblical criticism, which we saw perhaps most clearly in his recent critique of Wes Huff. And if you really want to understand these passages rather than just plucking them out of context to use as weapons, fueled by the ethical distaste you inherited from the very book you're criticizing, then you'll have to slow down from any tweet-sized one-liners and do some careful historical analysis. When we talk about the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, we are catching thin glimpses of cultures we cannot possibly understand. I've talked to missionaries who've spent decades living in foreign cultures, and even after all that time, they still feel like fish out of water over there. And if we think we can span not just different geography and language, but thousands of years of history, and judge ancient cultures with any kind of accuracy, especially with nothing more than a surface-level reading, we're kidding ourselves. But I can assure you that each time you investigate one of these passages that Alex routinely brings up, you will find that as the culture and context come into clearer view, it will look less and less like the caricature that he describes. That doesn't mean there aren't still passages that I find troubling, but it does mean that I have enough in the Bible and its overall cultural impact to give God the benefit of the doubt and assume that he has good reasons for everything he does, even when I can't understand him. This way of thinking, like it or not, is at the very foundation of the Christian worldview. Abraham is considered the father of our faith because he trusted God even when he didn't understand him. Near the beginning of Genesis, God promises Abraham that his son will have offspring as countless as the stars, but then he tells Abraham to kill that same son in the style of an animal sacrifice. Now, I have 3 sons, and I've tried to put myself in Abraham's shoes here and just imagine what it would be like to have God say something like that to me, and I just can't wrap my mind around it. But Abraham knows he can trust God, so he sets out to do exactly what he's told. Not because he was able to conjure some theological brilliance about God's rationale, which he couldn't have possibly known. He just knew he could trust God, and so he walked within that trust. In retrospect, we see that he never had to kill his son. It was all just a symbol, one more prediction thousands of years before it happened that one day God would sacrifice his son. But Abraham couldn't have known that. And that Abraham mindset, trusting God even when you don't understand him, is a prerequisite to becoming a Christian. That's why Paul says Christians are children of Abraham, and why Jesus says entering his kingdom requires adopting the mindset of a child. That means we can't always comprehend our Father, but we'll trust him anyway. Now I know many people will strongly resist this way of thinking and say, well, I'm not following God unless I can comprehend him. And that's up to you. This is exactly the choice that Christianity sticks to a person. You either let God be God, or you try and be your own God and learn just how hellish that is. That's the choice we all have to make. All I can do is leave that between you and God. But this brings me to a couple of questions that Alex is known to ask. Well, fine, he says, you have to trust God even if you don't understand him. So if he told you to shoot up in elementary school, would you do it? For one, the Bible says to test the spirits. So if I thought God was telling me to do something so morally repulsive, I would test that against what I know of him from the Bible and how I've experienced him in the past. The Bible says the sheep know the shepherd's voice. So I'd have to ask, does this feel like the past times that God has spoken to me? And because I know God's voice and influence firsthand, I'm strongly predisposed to doubt he would ever tell me to do something so horrible. It's certainly not comparable to the Abraham story, because God has made promises to Abraham that made it impossible for his son to die or at least stay dead. Either way, Abraham had strong reasons to believe God would provide a way out. There's a whole context and covenant involved in that story that would not be present in this shoot up a school hypothetical, which leads to my second point. Any question about God giving random commands is purely hypothetical, so it's no more philosophically useful than asking if I would run naked through downtown New York or eat a bowl of rusty nails if God asked me to. No substantive point is made here. It's just a question intended to cause discomfort by the sheer absurdity of it. And because it's not a useful question, there's no point in trying to answer it. Another question Alex will ask is, how can you claim God is the basis of our moral judgments and then ask me to suspend those same moral judgments when he commands something that feels so wrong? This question fails to distinguish between God being the basis of our moral judgments and our moral judgments being infallible. Those are two very different things. It's possible that our innate moral intuitions are evidence of being in God's image, even if those intuitions are unreliable. In fact, the Bible is explicit that this is the case. It says our hearts will deceive us, that we're warped by evil. That's why we need authoritative teaching like the Bible to measure ourselves against and realign our hearts with the heart of God. Alex's question also fails to distinguish between the morals that we live by and the things that God can do without violating his loving nature. We are limited in power and knowledge and love, so there are many things that we simply can't do and shouldn't try to do, even if God is perfectly justified in doing the same things because he has all the requisite power and knowledge and love to do them. We can return to the doctor analogy. If I sawed off someone's arm for any reason, I would be arrested, and rightfully so. But in some circumstances, a doctor may justifiably cut off someone's arm because he intends to save their life and has the skills necessary to perform the procedure with success, even if he causes pain in the process. In short, even if God is the only rational basis for human morality, that doesn't make it rational to judge him by human standards. Now, before we conclude this section, one final thing I want to point out is that Alex likes to draw a distinction between the God of the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament, and he'll even say, do I believe in the God of the Bible? I don't know. Which one? And his idea here is that the Old Testament God is this draconian war God, and Jesus is this soft, kind, gentle man with teachings that sound very Eastern and harmless. And I know this is a popular view, but when I read the Bible cover to cover, this distinction is not obvious to me. We've already talked about several themes that run through the Bible start to finish, and those themes do run through the Old and New Testaments, and in fact, Jesus often strengthens the Old Testament commands and makes them more difficult than they were originally thought to be. No one in the Bible talks about hell as much as Jesus, and he makes some startling comments about how he intends to judge the world someday. So this meek, gentle, harmless Jesus everyone is talking about, I can't actually find him in the Bible. The Jesus of the Bible is deadly serious, and he claims that if you've seen him, then you've seen the Father, as in the God of the Old Testament. He's extravagant with his love, yes, but that doesn't change the fact that what he says is often terrifying and really raises the stakes. The Old Testament stakes were largely physical, but Jesus makes the stakes spiritual and eternal, which is quite a bit scarier. So when Alex says, do I believe in the God of the Bible? Which one? And implies that Jesus is some sweet and harmless alternative to the draconian Old Testament God, I say give Jesus a closer look. You might find him quite a bit more serious than you thought. Not to say he isn't loving, but like a loving parent telling their toddler not to play in the street or their teenager not to dabble in narcotics, God's love can be expressed in some very serious ways, and never more serious than when Jesus is the one speaking. So, has Alex shown Christianity to be incoherent on the basis that the God of the Old Testament is immoral? No. Yet again, his arguments reach the pinnacle of their persuasiveness at precisely the moment they borrow distinctly Christian feelings for emotional impact. And even if we were to grant Alex's argument here, this leaves us in an awkward position since God's supposedly immoral behavior has zero effect on any of the prior arguments. Yet you have to take the worldview as a whole. Do we conclude that he exists but we just don't like him? Do we conclude that because we don't like him, he must not exist and then go back and accept a self-creating, self-designing universe and so on? No, the only rational conclusion we can draw from this is that God is incomprehensible. We may not understand what he does, and it may even startle and dismay us at times, but the leap from I don't understand you to you don't exist is not a rational leap. On the other hand, if the Christian God is everything the Bible claims he is, this doesn't just explain my inability to comprehend him, I expect it. In the words of Evelyn Underhill, if God were small enough to be understood, he would not be big enough to be worshipped. All right, Alex's last objection is the one commonly known as the problem of divine hiddenness. The specific argument from Alex is derived from J.L. Schellenberg, and I'll tailor it to Christianity, and it goes like this. There exist non-resistant non-believers, people who by no fault of their own do not believe in God's existence, but if the loving God of Christianity existed, there would be no non-resistant non-believers. Therefore, the Christian God does not exist. Like the cosmological argument, this argument is logically sound, so if you want to undermine it, you have to knock down at least one of the premises. In this case, both premises are problematic. Basic Christian thinking, not to mention common sense, undermines the second premise, since the road to belief can be a process that unfolds over time. So there may be people who aren't resistant to belief, but just haven't gotten there yet. Jesus said, "Seek and you will find." He didn't say, the very second you begin seeking, you will immediately find. So already we know there has to be something of a spectrum. On Christianity, no one seeking would get to the end of their life without finding God. Or, if they did, we assume, given God's sense of fairness, that he would give them an opportunity to accept him after death. But Alex also supports his hiddenness argument with an appeal to his own life. I got a theology degree, he says. I lived with Christians. I read a bunch of Christian books. I prayed, and nothing, not one single experience to make me think God's out there. Now, for one thing, Alex is 25 years old, so maybe he's just not there yet. C.S. Lewis didn't come around till he was in his 30s, but more importantly, I do have to admit that after doing a deep dive on Alex, he does give me trust issues. His channel begins with aggressively anti-Christian sentiments, and yet, when he debates Frank Turek way back in 2017, you see a dramatic shift in his tone. And he even says in that debate that he would love to convert to Christianity if the evidence were there, something he still routinely says in his debates. But then after that debate, he goes on to say in other contexts how angry he is at Christians for shoving their beliefs down people's throats, and his mission is to prove them all wrong, and the Bible is evil and dangerous, and he went to theology school to, quote, keep his enemies close, and he wouldn't follow the Christian God even if Christianity were true. Don't get me wrong, I know he spends more time nowadays taking a gentle, level-headed approach, but I have to take that behavior in the context of someone who already understood the force of credibility when he was a teenager, and I've seen him dramatically shift his tone depending on who he's talking to multiple times. So as much as I would like to, I just can't take Alex's word for it when he says he's sincerely seeking. It's equally plausible from where I sit that he's just making a sophisticated attempt to bolster his credibility. I also have to consider Alex's claim to be a non-resistant non-believer in light of more personal details he's mentioned along the way. For instance, both of his parents are atheists, and as far as I can tell, he has a very strict view of Christian salvation and hell, so he has strong emotional reasons for hoping Christianity is false. He also used to have these experiences of terror, this sort of, oh my goodness, I'm opposing God, I'm in trouble feeling. And he explains away these episodes as vestiges of being raised nominally Christian, but then he says if those pangs of fear were genuine spiritual experiences, then that was a, quote, immoral way for God to try and grab his attention. I assume he must find all of Jesus talk about hell immoral as well. On a more positive note, Alex has described these sorts of transcendent experiences with music and art that seem to defy rational explanation, but then he chalks these up to accidents of evolution. And here's some really interesting anecdata from Alex's life. In one of his early talks to an atheist humanist organization in Los Angeles, he describes this conversation with a Muslim girl at the airport who told him about a demonic experience, and all the humanists with their imaginary morals laughed and laughed over the imaginary demon, and then Alex says he couldn't help himself. He had to sow the atheist seed and let her know that one of his Christian friends had a similar experience recently, but the Christian attributed the experience to something totally different. And because the Christian and Muslim can't both be right, Alex concludes they must both be delusional. He never stops to ask himself why two people in his life, who I assume don't appear mentally ill, are having supernatural experiences. I mean, this is right out of Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton, where he observes that believers accept miracles because there's a, quote, choking cataract of human testimony in favor of the supernatural. Atheists, on the other hand, deny miracles because they have a strong doctrine against them. Christians follow the evidence. Atheists ignore any evidence that violates their dogma. And look, Alex did it right out there in front of all his atheist friends, and no one seemed to notice. Just last month, Francis Collins described a first-hand supernatural experience to Alex. But Alex already knew before that testimony ever reached his ears that no such thing could ever happen in a materialist world, and so the brand new testimonial evidence fell on deaf ears. The power of dogma. Why do I bring all this up? Because Alex doesn't look very non-resistant to me. He looks like the man described by Blaise Pascal, who reads a few passages of the Bible, debates a few priests, and then claims he sought but did not find, and even boasts as though his lack of belief is something to be proud of. Which leads to a very important point. The argument from Hiddenness as framed by Alex implies that belief is the highest good. Alex wonders why God doesn't just drag him into belief like Paul or C.S. Lewis, but the Bible points out that even the demons believe, so clearly belief cannot be the highest good. It's also worth noting that the Bible says humans will someday judge angels, which implies that this confusing arena we've been dropped into is building us into something greater than angels. And speaking of angels, it seems that they were given a sterile choice like the one Alex evidently wants. They stood face to face with God, and many of them rejected God to his face, once and for all time. What might that mean for us? Well, Jesus says the one unforgivable sin is to blaspheme, as an insult, the Holy Spirit. And one biblical writer says it is impossible to experience the Holy Spirit and fall back into rebellion and then be saved all over again. It seems that once a person or angel rejects God to his face, that's it. You've made your choice. Taste and see that the Lord is good, writes the psalmist, but if your taste buds go sour, what sweetness can there be for you? How could you even tell the difference between heaven and hell at that point? So it could be that the reason God holds back from revealing himself more fully to certain people is to give them time to become the kinds of people who will love him when he does reveal himself. C.S. Lewis is a great example. He describes the sense of longing throughout his life that was especially stoked by certain writers like George MacDonald, but it was only later that Lewis learned those writers were Christian. So Lewis already loved God before he even knew what it was that he was loving. And since God wants not merely belief, but love, it's easy to imagine that for some people demanding proof of his existence, God would withhold himself until they're primed to love him. That brings us back to the burden of trust that we began with. We come awake in this world surrounded by mysteries, dangling over the abyss, and we have to decide what rope to grab onto. One option, of course, is atheism, which really just means materialist assumptions, but if you're a public atheist, actively obstructing belief in Jesus, that means you're not just holding onto your own rope, but also trying to wrench hope and a sense of purpose and meaning out of other people's hands whenever you get the chance. And if you're the kind of person who can stand amidst these mysteries and make a decision like that, are you sure you would like what you found if you met God face to face? Even for the best of people, the Bible doesn't describe being face to face with God, the consuming fire, as a pleasant experience. Typically, even just to see an angel leaves a person terror-stricken and grieved at their own wickedness and eager to flee the scene. But if you've made a platform out of actively turning people away from God, how much more devastating might that encounter be? Paul certainly didn't enjoy his encounter, but at least when he was murdering Christians, he was doing it because he thought God wanted him to. Alex appears to oppose Christianity for the sheer enjoyment of it, or I guess at this point for the money, even if that means violating his own ethical system to do it. Perhaps God is waiting for Alex to become the kind of person who would love God if he met him. But let me be clear, in the end, I can only speculate on what's going on in Alex's head and heart. For the purpose of this debate, all I'm saying is that his testimony isn't nearly strong enough to firmly establish that he's a non-resistant non-believer. All signs point to him being a perfectly zealous non-believer. But before we leave the divine hiddenness argument, we have to consider a subset of it that I'll call the argument from geography. Alex claims that where a person is born is a reliable statistical indicator of what their worldview will be, and he claims on atheism we don't just explain this distribution, we expect it. So atheism has once again morphed very conveniently into a synonym for materialism, and as I mentioned, you can only say atheism expects this phenomenon after granting atheism a long list of wild assumptions that Christianity does a much better job of explaining. I won't go through that list again, but I will add to it that atheism doesn't explain why people across numerous cultures have such religious predispositions and seem to, in the words of one biblical writer, have eternity set in their hearts. Alex says local mythologies account for people's various religions, but this just begs the question of why every locale is so religious as to craft those mythologies in the first place. On the other hand, if people are made in God's image, then we expect them to be innately religious. So even if they don't always know exactly what to worship, they'll worship something. Christianity predicts this. But there are other problems with Alex's argument from geography. For one, Christianity isn't geographically bound. It's unique among religions in its capacity to adapt to a variety of cultures. This has been pointed out to Alex, and he just responds by moving the goalposts and arguing that Christianity's adaptability just explains why it's successful, not why it's true, but no one said Christianity's adaptability makes it true. Christianity is supported by much stronger arguments than that, but if Christianity's influence isn't geographically bound, then Alex's argument from geography is weakened. Another problem with this argument is that it seems to rely on Alex's very strict view of hell and salvation, and seems to assume that anyone who doesn't accept Jesus in this life is automatically condemned. But no thoughtful Christian believes this. Most will say a person is judged by whatever evidence they had available to them, even if that evidence is just the simple fact of God's fingerprints all over creation. There are multiple contexts in which salvation is thought to extend beyond those who openly call themselves Christian, such as those who lived before Jesus walked the earth. And when Christianity was born, it was limited to a very small group around Palestine, sort of like the entire Israelite story is said to have begun with one man named Abraham. In the Bible, God's plans begin small and unfold over time, and thoughtful Christians don't conclude from this that everyone in the world gets sent straight to hell if they weren't nearby for the early stages. The overarching principle comes straight from Jesus' mouth. He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by me." And his people trust that whatever arrangement he reaches with the Father will be perfectly fair, including for those who've never heard of him. But by far the biggest problem with Alex's argument from geography is that it's just another way of saying, if I were God, I would have spread Christianity differently, therefore it must not be true. And if I haven't made this clear by now, when a 25-year-old atheist YouTuber or anyone else shows up and says, if I were God, I would have done this differently, that would be a great time to exercise some skepticism. Atheism certainly doesn't predict humanity's innate religiosity, nor does it predict the impressive global impact of Christianity. On the other hand, if it's true that we're made in God's image, that Jesus came from God to save the world, and that God's plans unfold over time, then we don't just explain the amorphous, ever-unfolding global Christian phenomenon, we expect it. All right, it's time to wrap this up. But first, let's do a quick review because we've been at this for a while, and there are several facts on the table that Alex and Christianity explain very differently. We have the Big Bang, which Alex attributes to either the infinite regress of universes hypothesis or his favorite response, the universe just created itself out of nothing. Christianity says God created it. We have the intricate fine-tuning of the universe, which Alex doesn't exactly respond to. He just asks if this means God is constrained by the parameters of his own invention, or if God had a secret wish that life never got started. Christianity says God fine-tuned the universe. We have humanity's innate sense of morality, which Alex says natural selection gave humans, and only humans, as expressions of the emotional states yay and boo. Christianity says we're moral because we're made in God's image. We have the historical accounts around Jesus, his resurrection, and the rise of Christianity, which Alex attributes to something really weird happening. Christianity says Jesus is the Son of God and that he rose from the dead. We have the problem of evil, by which Alex says, if I were God, I wouldn't have allowed all this evil. Christians trust that the biblical pattern will hold, and that all evils will give way to greater goods in the end. We have the problem of God, by which Alex says, if I were God, I wouldn't have done any of that. Christians say it's rational to trust God and equally irrational to think we'll comprehend him. And finally, we have the problem of divine hiddenness, by which Alex says, if I were God, I would have revealed myself differently. Christians trust that when Jesus said, seek and you will find, he meant it. Reviewing a list like this, it's easy to see why William of Ockham, inventor of Occam's razor, was a Christian. Unlike Christianity, atheism has to do some really complex mental gymnastics to evade the most obvious conclusions. So, in the matter of Alex O'Connor versus Christianity, the question before you, the jury, is this. Has Alex shown Christianity to be irrational? I don't think he has. And for our counterclaim, has Alex shown his own platform to be irrational? I think he has. His moral philosophy is pleasure-based, and it's empirically well established that religion improves a person's life across the board. By his own definition of morality, he has an immoral platform. At least, that's what I say. But this isn't my decision to make. You're the jury. and it's for you to deliberate and decide on these questions. So comment on this video and let me know what you decide, and even better if you explain what the most crucial evidence was in your decision-making process. Until then, God bless you, and let me know if there's anyone else whose case against Christianity you'd like me to consider. I don't know who's next, and I'm open to suggestions. Also, if there's some other topic you'd like to see covered, let me know that too. We're in the early stages here. And in the meantime, I rest my case.